I'm Barry Friedman. I'm a law professor at New York University School of Law, and I'm the faculty director of the Policing Project. Our mission is to work to see that policing is democratically accountable, transparent, and equitable, particularly along racial lines. I am joined here today by Mike Moore, who's the chief of the Los Angeles Police Department. Hi, Mike.
Good morning.
Glad to have you here. I'll let everybody watching know that as best as I can tell from your bio, you've been with the LAPD for about 40 years and done every job there is to do at the LAPD. Is that accurate?
4 decades plus. It's been a privilege of a lifetime.
I got it. I've been teaching for over 30 years, so I get it. We are here to talk today about a proposal by the Los Angeles Police Protective League that came out in early March about a number of calls that police officers perhaps should no longer respond to, calls for service, the calls to 911. At the Policing Project, we've long been interested, and in my work, I've long been interested in this question of alternative response, of whether police officers are the right responders to respond to a number of calls that come into 911 and who might be better. We're going to talk about why that might make sense and about the proposal. I thought it would make sense, Chief, if we could I'm going to ask somebody on my team to put up on the screen the list of call types that the Protective League suggested would not be responded to any longer. If we could put that up. There you go. And I'm just going to give everybody a second to scan over it. Now we can start to talk about it. So let's start to talk about this, and my folks can just pull that down in a minute or two so we can focus on the conversation. Could you say a word to us about what motivated this? I mean, I read the preamble to the proposal, and it mentions things like understaffing and a delay in response to 911, a drop in clearance rates, and particularly officer morale. You may have more insight behind the scenes than we all have from a piece of paper. I wondered if you could just say a word about what your understanding is of what brought this about and at the time that it did.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be a member of this fireside chat, I guess, is what we're calling it. Your work, the department has followed closely. I think we've continued to be, as an organization, leading from the front on 21st century policing. And certainly the Policing Project has been one to help inform us as to alternatives and the evolution of policing and how to look at it perhaps from a different frame of reference. When the Los Angeles Police Protective League, which is a bargaining unit for the vast majority of the rank and file of the organization, stepped forward with this proposal, I had a couple different reactions. First, the overall is that they were simply formalizing the fact that what every rank and file member of this organization knows, and many of us in policing know, which is that policing has been asked to do too much for too long with too little, that because we are ever present 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, along with our fire partners in public safety, that in the absence of social services, in the absence of other resources that make up government, as well as NGOs and the faith community, it comes down to landing on the police department. Well, who else is going to handle this call? And so this is, I think, the latest chapter of the now the labor union coming forward and saying, we agree with this. We agree that there should be alternatives. Now, I disagree with the manner in which they frame it. This is not a bargaining issue. This is not the determination of what the Los Angeles Police Department responds to. It's something as chief of police is my responsibility under the oversight of the Board of Police Commissioners, which are appointed by the mayor. It's not a rank and file labor issue for us to agree that officers will respond to these instances, but will not respond to that. That's something that we're going to retain. We need to retain the responsibilities of. However, I want to take the road of appreciating the fact that they acknowledge that, because there's many in our communities that think that law enforcement's opposed to this, that somehow alternatives that we see as a threat to our existence or to our funding or staffing, and nothing can be further from the truth. The reality of the matter is that we have sought alternatives to policing for the 4+ decades that I've been a member of this organization. In fact, over the course of time, many calls to 911 do not result in a response of law enforcement or fire for that matter. Approximately a third, we find alternatives that these are not police matters, that these are matters that are best dealt with either in a non-emergency matter by some other part of city or county government, or simply it's just not warranting a public response of a public agency. However, we've also been a leader when it comes to finding co-response models. Our police, our domestic assault response teams, and by the way, today is Denim Day across America, and it's recognizing the violence against women, and in recognizing that law enforcement and our victim advocates and others all play a critical role in protecting women from sexual assaults and physical violence and emotional violence by others that would prey on them. But to the point of the domestic abuse response teams, it's a clinician in concert with a trained officer with added resources that responds to domestic assault investigations, not in regards to the offender and sense of whether an arrest will be made, but in regards to support for the victim, for supportive services, wraparound services to end the cycle of violence. And we've found that model over the last more than 20 years has had better outcomes in reducing the recidivism of offenders, but also improving the resilience and the survivability of victims who fall prey to domestic violence. So the organization has, over the course of time, evolved and found means by necessity as well as by putting the right resource on the problem. And that resource is not always, in fact, frequently is not the police department, in this shared responsibility of what public safety means to us as Americans.
So let me pick up a lot there, a lot to unpack. Let me pick up right at the end, though, with your point about the right response. So if we were going to try to generalize for the nation, if not the world, and I really do think that the work that we're talking about today ought to be generalizable. A lot of the questions that we got were about how do we do this in our jurisdiction. You talked about the right resource. How do we know? And I've also heard the head of the police union, Lieutenant Craig Lally, talk about this also, sending the right responder to the right situation. How do we roughly know who's the right responder and which responders might be better to the police and why it is that the police might not be the right responder in a situation? How do we think about that?
Well, I think we need to think about it not just from the police department's perspective, and whether that be a line officer or chief of police, but also working with other partners in the criminal justice system, working with mental health and public health officials, working with our universities and our organizations, our academia that can do research and studies and look at what the outcomes are, and work through the very complexities of when these type of responses are in play, what are the types of outcomes, and where are opportunities for us to improve the process by adjusting the mixture. And this is a constant evolution, because at the same time, we must all recognize that this is very delicate work and it's nuanced work. And while of 1 million cycles, that out of those 1 million cycles, we have to be right 100% of the time. So in process improvement, we need to understand what's the underlying goal. And the underlying goal is safety of the community, safety of victims from further harm, safety of the offender in the sense of their introduction into whether it be the criminal justice system or the proper resolution of their conduct, safety of officers, safety of the surrounding community. So those are, and in that process, though, it's much like we do today. What are the instances in which we know historically over time that a police officer's response is going to add that layer of safety, that assurance of safety, so that everyone goes home? What is, much like the fire department, what is the assessment of the scene so that we send the right equipment to the scene? There's a house fire versus a chemical fire at a chemical plant. Now, both of those, in the fire department's analogy, will sort through, the call taker will sort through a description of the venue, of the type of fire, what information they can gather, and then they'll size up and deploy resources that are appropriate to that. An airline crash on an airport is differently than an apartment fire. The police department does the same thing. When we take an intake of a call, we'll first determine, is it a criminal matter? Secondly, if it is a criminal matter, is there a propensity for violence, or is there violence ongoing? Is the offender there? Is the victim there? And then what are the safeguards that we've seen over the wash, rinse, repeat, over time, that we see the appropriate tools being brought to bear have the best opportunity for outcomes. For instance, we know that many family disputes or domestic squabbles, if you will, that a trained professional upon arrival will separate the parties, will understand the actions of everyone involved, determine whether a crime has been committed, and then apply the appropriate state sanctions on arrest, prosecution, so to speak. But in that dialogue, many of those are handled without any violence or handled any violence against police officers. But we also know that that's one of the most dangerous calls for police officers because of the suddenness on which it can go very violent. And so you may have 10,000 calls that have everyone essentially goes along with quote unquote the program. And then you have one individual that when it comes time that an arrest is going to take place or otherwise, suddenly acts very violently in a very deadly fashion to escape consequences or escape their accountability. And it costs an officer their life, or costs a spouse or another family member because they react this suddenly. So in those instances, historically, for instance, at a department, we've learned over decades that 40 or 50 years ago, we used to dispatch one officer to a domestic violence call. We would allow officers to work those instances for sake of economy by themselves. And then we saw instances in which officers lost their life in those investigations. And so we redirected our resources and required multiple officers to respond as an issue of contact and cover. The same goes here for alternate responses. The department wants to see us continue to evolve and as a society and build resources that allow alternatives to policing. And we need to do it in a manner, though, that can safely achieve that goal and not jeopardize the very theory because of some of the items in which people say, well, just unilaterally, a landlord-tenant dispute should never have a police officer respond. Well, I take issue with that. I think there's instances in which there are indications of precursors of violence or potential for violence in which the safety of everyone involved benefits by having an officer's presence. Maybe we need a mediator there with them, someone who's not a law enforcement professional that can bring a different perspective in and skill set. But the safety of everyone involved is benefited by the presence of the officers.
So there's a lot there again, and I want to unpack it. I think what I'd like to do is maybe set a little agenda here. So to summarize, as you've alluded, but I'll make explicit for everyone listening, there's sort of three general models. There's the police only model. There's the co-responder model where the police respond with somebody else, like you mentioned, a mediator or a mental health professional. And then there might be a model in which the responders are simply non-police. So with those models on the table and taking account of your concerns about risk, which I want to talk about at length, because I think this is one of the great challenges in this space. If we could just shift over first to the alternative responders all by themselves, or maybe not all by themselves, maybe as co-responding. I'm just curious what it is you understand them to add on top of the police officer alone. In other words, why might we, whether we're co-responder or alternative responder, think that the police officer isn't alone the best responder and we need some other skills?
Yeah. Well, so I want to applaud let's keep focused on the three models. And the co-response model, as a department, we've learned greatly that having other disciplines at the table and present there with us does better problem solving, whether that's in an immediate 911 response or that's in any type of problem, that the shared responsibility is gained, success is gained when we have other perspectives and disciplines that come to the table. It's much like a unified command with a public emergency, right? You have fire there, you have traffic control, and you have policing resources as necessary. Some instances are led by the fire department, such as a fire with a straight fire building, a building's on fire and evacuation. We're providing for the fire department to be able to get there and for the safety of them and control access to that area. Other instances, you have an active shooter on that location who's also setting fire to the building. In that instance, it's a police-led matter because we have officers and fire personnel that would be at great risk trying to stop the gunman's actions while also protect others because of the threat of the building. We are entirely supportive of building out the alternative response that does not have a law enforcement component as a co-responder and building that to scale. We have examples here in Los Angeles that are working wonderfully. We have a program called the Circle program, which involves a mental health professional, a person who's been previously experienced homelessness, and they go out and they work to establish relationships with persons who are experiencing homelessness, may have a substance abuse issue. Certainly housing is a challenge, and building relationships over time to encourage them to move away from encampments and in instances where they're impacting the sense of safety and public order in a community. And at the same time, they also are facing great risks to their own personal safety because they live in very dire situations. We've seen that program accomplish wonderful things. It's been much more effective in getting individuals who may be otherwise resistant or untrusting of public government to take advantage of housing, interim and on a path to more permanent housing, to take advantage of those opportunities that a police officer may otherwise offer, and we've seen offer, and the person reject because of a sense of a cynicism or a lack of safety or confidence that that officer is actually interested in their welfare. Secondly, we've seen hundreds of calls that we've been able to divert to those resources of minor disorder issues in a community where there's not an immediate threat or even it doesn't appear that there's going to be a violent interaction. And those resources working across the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a critical component, have been allowed to, has allowed us to see reduced call load on police officers, improve safety in those communities, and individuals transition away from their homeless condition into housing and supportive services. So those type of responses, I'm proud of the city of Los Angeles working with the county to develop those resources. We also have, that is not to scale, emergency psych teams, but in a county of 10 million, we have 5. And unfortunately, they do not work around the clock, 7 days a week. And so what happens is, while they're able to service the clientele, that when their engagement is there, they're able to deal with emergency situations, with acute circumstances to get necessary services. We find frequently that those crises occur at times in which they're not working. And as a department, then we're left with handling that call, responding to that call, and trying to deal with those circumstances without the resources, and really not necessitating us to be there to begin with, but for an absence of our resources. So I believe the future and success in this area, which I'm glad to see the renewal in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder and the calls to further reform and reimagine public safety, is that as a city and as a county, state, and country, that we build out the social service programs to 24/7 metrics. Because today, frankly, it's a Monday through Friday, weekends and holidays off. And even in the aftermath of COVID, it's even worse because now many people are working from home. And so they're not even in a clinical setting. And certainly the field responses have been compromised because of the inability to find mental health workers and others that find that as a necessary attribute for employment, because there's ample opportunities in these other venues.
So again, I'm going to keep simplifying just to put us on an organized track. There are any number of calls that I think is, if I understand you correctly, the police just don't have the exact skill set that we need. In fact, you've named a number of skill sets: mediation, mental health, disorder, which I want to talk to you about some more. And you've also, I think, offered a compelling reason, not to have police there, just in terms of the paucity of resources. But at the same time, you mentioned and that there's a chance that anything could become problematic. And I just want to talk about, I guess, 2 pieces of that. First is how we're going to figure those out. I'm going to take these in reverse order. And second, I think you also acknowledged, and I think it's important to be candid about this, but I'd be interested to hear you say a word, which is that there are risks from the police not responding, which I want to get to and figure out how we assess those. But there are some downsides to the police responding as well. So you mentioned, for example, the individuals who are unhoused, who may be less willing to accept resources from the police. And obviously there are, police shootings, which are tragedies, but there's a whole range in between. I mean, people that just don't want to deal with the government at all, concerns about the use of force. So I guess let's just start with I'm building like an algorithm here as I talk, which is, you know, a call comes in and there are some skill sets that we need from the police. There are a lot of skill sets that the police don't have, and we have a different responder. We can either co-respond or alternative respond. Would you just agree that there are reasons that that alternative response without a police officer are desirable if we can get there?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the challenge today is the scarcity of those resources. We know that there are alternatives that we should be using. I'll give you a very classic example. The city of Los Angeles separated traffic control from a department responsibility in 1978. It's a fully civilianized, non-law enforcement position. And its staffing is primarily day watch. And so what happens with traffic control and problems with congestion and challenges to keep the movement of traffic going in the off hours is we have sent a police officer. So we send an overly authoritative resource to a situation that doesn't generally result in any kind of conflict, but it taxes our resources because that resource has not been built out and maintained at a level that it should. And those examples are readily available all around us, whether it be conflict resolution, mental health issues, low-level public disorder issues that can simply take an ambassador or a person that can go out and approach some individual. We see this in the policing world and security world all the time. We don't need police officers to provide security at buildings. We have security officers that can do that. And then when you have the types of security, we for a long time as organizations, we recognize that businesses will have uniformed guards. Sometimes they'll have armed or unarmed guards. Other times there'll be men and women that are in suits or some type of polo outfit. And these layers deal with the types of security that they need and the environment in which they exist. And adjusting the model is something that we as a department is desirous of. As government, we amplify and that we build out. What's unfortunately happened is we're just going to, many times the blunt, and I'll close, the blunt forceness of, well, we're just going to create this as a necessity by eliminating hundreds and hundreds of officers. And by necessity, officers won't be able to do this work. And this by necessity will create this other resource. That's not a way to run public safety and build confidence in government. When you run a relay race, if you're going to hand this responsibility off, there's got to be someone to pick up the baton. It would be irresponsible to do it otherwise.
So I'm going to give us the liberty of imagining, and we can even imagine into the future, because I certainly followed a lot of the publicity around the announcement by the union. I heard the mayor's office, express concern about compromising public safety. City council members enthusiastic, but also noticing the lack of resources. So obviously there's a build out that needs to happen, and this isn't going to happen overnight. And you stress an important part of this, which is for some of these calls, the build out's got to be 24/7. And until that happens, it's, whether you think the police are the right responder or not, that's who you're going to get, unless and until you've got somebody else doing it. So, so I'm there with you about that. You've named, I just want to think out loud for a minute about where you'd build out, if you had a magic wand. So you've mentioned mental health, you've mentioned mediation. I'm intrigued by the minor disorder and community ambassadors. You've mentioned some traffic. We'll get into traffic enforcement, but certainly minor accidents, things like that. Any other area that you would think we should be looking at?
Well, I think those are all good positions. In fact, as a department in the last 2 years, we've realigned our response to traffic collisions, where today we'll only respond to traffic collisions involving serious injuries, death, or a felony such as a hit and run with an injury, or driving under the influence resulting in a collision. Otherwise, 25,000, 30,000 of these investigations that we'd otherwise historically been involved in, we no longer respond, and we ask the individuals who have this unfortunate circumstance to go online and submit the report as a means for their records and for their insurance purposes and otherwise. But it doesn't, we look back and said, this doesn't require this. And so we've made those adjustments. We've made our adjustments to alarm calls, where our alarm call will go off. There's businesses and homes all across Los Angeles, city of 4 million. And we used to respond to hundreds of thousands of these calls. 99% of them were false. 98, 99% of them were false. I did my undergraduate degree on this issue, and just because we can doesn't mean we should. And we realigned our response where we would only respond to verified alarms with a license, if you will, or if a person saw a person actually breaking into that home or leaving that business, and that again helped us harvest resources and also identify to the public, well, you can, if you need to have some type of response, then hire security, hire additional resource. That this is, from the public standpoint, scarcity of police resources is that its continued false alarm nature of it. It's not a good bet. It's not a good investment of police resources. So I think that going forward, I think you look at each of these syringe disposals, illegal vending. These are areas that we would love to see. For instance, in Los Angeles, street services is responsible. A civilian part of our public works department is responsible for vending, and public health department is responsible for the vending of food. And we recognize the the hazards that are in both those areas, and it shouldn't be a police response. Again, the key for us is meeting the public's expectations. We, the collective public government, meet that. What will they be satisfied with as far as response? And then from us, from an intellectual standpoint, ensure that we invest in those alternatives. So we simply don't say we're just going to stop responding when there is a public interest. And secondly, not over prescribing police resources when they're not needed.
Yeah, so it's quite a list that you've come up with, and I think it's it seems right to me as I've thought about it intellectually, and I've written about it some. I'm always intrigued by burglar alarms and traffic accidents because somehow the police became workers for the insurance companies and burglar alarm companies, and it's never made sense to me. We've looked at data in other jurisdictions. It's very hard, as you and I have discussed at other times, to penetrate the data sometimes that we have for calls for service. But you get up to 20% pretty fast just looking at traffic, not necessarily in LA, but in other jurisdictions, traffic accidents, burglar alarms, welfare checks, things like that. So it's a lot of different needs, and you have really, given us a long list. Where I entered into all this really at the beginning was, why are police the one size fit all responder for, what by now you've given us like 8 or 9 different things. I guess the question I want to ask you, which is one I chew on a lot, is, pretty soon you've got a lot of different responders. Mm-hmm. And if they're not emergencies, they can go to a 211 or 311 line. We've tried to siphon off mental health into a 988 line, which is a good idea. But there's problems from both directions. On the one hand, everybody's not going to remember what line they need to call for which thing. And on the other, a lot of these calls are going to come into 911 as emergencies, even if police are not the necessary responder. Have you ever given any thought, and I confess I have a lot, to some sort of holistic responder? In other words, not unarmed responders with a range of skills, be they social services, dispute resolution, some mental health training, so we don't have to try to parcel this out, because I could see it quickly becoming a major nightmare from the dispatch perspective to know which team to call out.
Well, yes, I think the part of this is, again, you've made a compounded question there, because you've got calls to 911 because that's the last resort, and it's the first thing that comes to mind. People say, I'll just call 911. We see that. We have millions of calls that, as I said, don't require police response. They want to know what the weather is. They want to know what time the zoo opens. I mean, it's just the abuse of 911, because, well, we'll ask 911. And so that's part of an education program, and also not rewarding bad conduct by sending a police response when it's not needed. The call screening that we go through and the training that we go through to identify the elements of the underlying conduct that the person's calling for is critical. For instance, today, this last year, we implemented a referral to an organization. It's a community-based organization called D.D. Hirsch, so that mental health related calls, people contemplating suicide, bout of depression, they call 911 for help. And we now refer those to this 24/7 call center. And that's allowed us to divert thousands of calls so the right mental health counselor and assessor can be there and determine, is there an immediate response needed by a mental health professional? Or is this something that can take a bout of some counseling and then some follow-up care to ensure the person has the needed resources? Historically, those organizations didn't exist. And in the absence of that, because of a concern that this individual may take their own life, we would dispatch police and fire resources. And then out of 1 million calls, one would go terribly bad. And then the department would be the one facing the criticism of, well, why were you there even to begin with? We've also changed our conduct. We have what's called tactical de-escalation in the last 5 years, where individuals who are contemplating suicide and are calling us saying that they're contemplating, rather than respond and surround the location and eventually force our way in to help that person, only at times to be met with violence, and then officers defending themselves shoot and kill the individual who was attempting to commit suicide, is we said, well, let's assess this. Do we need to tactically disengage from this, attempt to get the person needed mental health resources, but not escalate the situation by our continued involvement? And that took some training across an organization that says, well, if I'm not here, who's going to pick this up? Because culturally, it's the concept, it's a famous movie scene. It's a better generation gap here of Thank God It's Friday. But with, thank God it's Friday. Friday, Joe Friday would arrive, and he's the person that's going to fix everything. And I think too many times policing has been seen that way. And that mindset is changing, which I'm grateful for. And as a department, we're leaning into that, and we're encouraging our elected officials to continue to invest. And to the point of how you ensure their safety, I think we need to look back and see how have we had success in this area in other fields. Our gang reduction youth development efforts in the Los Angeles area since 2005, 2006 has identified intervention and gang violence reduction strategies that don't involve the police, but involve individuals, many of them previously in the gang lifestyle and in that turmoil. And with added training and their interest and commitment to trying to stop the cycle of violence with gang neighborhood disputes and so forth, go out and effectively build relationships with gang members, with individuals that are attracted to associates and so forth, to reduce rumors, to encourage peace, to talk to give victim support services and families, to lower the temperature. Now that's work that 20 years ago people would say, oh, my gosh, I can't be out there at 3 a.m. Who are you going to get to go out at 3 a.m. and be in these parks and be in these neighborhoods and have those type of interactions? It's so unsafe. Well, what we found was that there are individuals who are willing to do that work. And if it's properly trained and governed, that they can be very effective. And we've seen gang violence, particularly retaliatory shootings, reduce significantly, and peace improved, and the instances of police having to resort to arrest or having to resort to force have been reduced. So I think we need to look at models that have worked. I've referenced one earlier today, such as the CIRCLE program. We need to look and see from those professionals, what have they learned over the period of time? And that includes, how do we maintain those workers in that space? Because it's hard work. It's not always successful. It's not all sugar plums. There's crises. There's times in which workers are endangered. There's times in which they may be injured. And there's individuals who leave the field out of just getting simply burnt out. And so how do we anticipate that and build the resilience? And I think part of that is wages, conditions, standing in a profession and a community, and certainly working with all of government to figure out how do we integrate that into a successful scenario. And lastly, I'm going to close. It would be a disservice to 17,000 law enforcement agencies across the country if I did not identify that these alternatives, both within organizations as well as in surrounding network of public service, that these examples exist in many agencies across America. Alternatives to traffic collisions, for instance, the use of volunteers, the use of civilians within the police profession, the civilianization efforts. I'm sure the policing project is aware of our efforts in the department to civilianize many posts that don't require a sworn police officer to do the work, and finding alternatives outside of policing that builds the scale and are funded and perpetuate themselves. Those are efforts that are ongoing, I think, in many agencies across the country today.
Yeah, I'd like to just chat a bit about motivations. And it's fascinating what you just said about the shout out to all the agencies that do this. And this is true not just to policing agencies, but mayor's offices and social service agencies. We've been thinking a lot about, uh, who's like a spokesperson for this in the country. And this has really been an organic movement growing from the bottom up. It is not like there's some top down, let's as a country have alternative response. I think communities and police departments and mayor's offices have recognized along the way that there's a real need out there and are just sort of trying to build from the ground up. Part of the reason we do this work is to try to bring all these individuals together. There's a huge call out there for, how can we speak with people in other cities? How can we learn the lessons that they've learned in easy and hard ways? I guess what I want to ask you, I mean, you've ticked off a lot of different responders now, mediators, mental health, violence interrupters, which I think definitely is very important to notice, dealing with disorder in certain areas, teams that deal with folks who are unhoused or have substance issues. The union's proposal, twice at the beginning of it, points to agreement between communities and the officers about the need for these responses and the fact that armed officers are not always the right responders. And I'm sure their motivations aren't necessarily the same, but if I could just get your instinct about what you think motivates communities to be so focused on this right now at this moment, and then officers, what motivates them? Let's go in that order. I'd just be curious. I'm guessing they're not exactly the same, but I'd be curious what they are.
So let me do a bit of a plug here. Bureau of Justice Assistance, BJA, is a tremendous resource for every stakeholder you've identified. They've established a lab, if you will, that establishes emerging and best practices in this area. I do think the Justice Department, and I do think our Attorney General is working on this issue in the aftermath of particularly amplified in the aftermath of George Floyd's death and the calls for greater social justice and reforms to the criminal justice system. So the motivation, I think, for the public is to address this issue of a perception that that policing is the wrong tool, that while many instances it can address the circumstance successfully, that the public's reliance on that does two things. One, it overburdens the police so that more essential work and trust building and investigations and engagements with identifying those responsible for preying upon others and bringing them before the criminal justice system, those activities are hampered because of this burden of these other lower, less essential functions that should be handled by an alternative. Secondly, there are adverse outcomes at times because of a temperament of the fact that you have the police with a overarching concern for their safety and others that make an error, make a mistake, and now violence erupts and a person, a life is lost or some other injustice occurs that, well, you had the wrong tool there, and so it was an overreaction where someone else not having that same tool set may have sought a different outcome, may have sought some other resolution because they didn't have that authority, they didn't have that capability at hand. Now, as far as the police department, it is, I think, a process of, again, demonstration of adherence to our core values and to our true mission to protect and serve, and then understanding how the public views us at times that our best efforts are actually undermining the trust of the department, because while we think we're helping, in reality, our presence is seen as oppressive, as punitive, and is not appreciated. And having the ability to stop and say, how do we get here? This is that proverbial person in the swamp, right? How did I get here? What was my original intent? And while well-intended, it has had this unintended impact on public trust. So being willing to step back and not solve every problem and looking at public safety as a shared responsibility and not just our responsibility. Lastly, I'll close. Problem-solving methods, when we look at the community policing and problem-solving policing, the challenge with that versus community policing was sometimes police were all the problem solvers. So they were the head of the table and they were the ones like an orchestrator, like the person, the conductor of an orchestra telling everyone what to do in order to play the music. And what we see in community policing as a benefit is that there's problem-solving efforts, but there is a collective work together to build a collaborative approach in which we are not the lead. We have a role and we have a responsibility and maybe a cohesion and a flywheel of momentum, but we should not be attempting to solve every problem that is before us.
Yeah, I mean, I actually didn't expect it going into the question, but if you think about what it is you just said, there was a lot of similarity between the community and the police motives. I mean, there was officer resources. There was a concern that sometimes when the police show up, there's some harm that follows from that because they're not the right tool. And also a huge desire to just get the right tool there to solve the problem. So those are the same three things we identify very often as the reason to go in this direction. I guess what I want to pivot now is to think a little bit about the future of policing. So I don't know what the time horizon is on the future that I'm about to describe. But let's imagine a world in which we could build out everything that you said. And let's also imagine a world in which that all works coherently. I have my concerns, and if we have time, we'll come back to that. But let's just imagine that world. I mean, I don't think it's happening in the next 5 years, and I hope it happens in the next 10. So that's my horizon. You might have a different horizon. It's just a lot of building out that needs to happen. But let's say we do it. And let's start to think ahead to what the world looks like for the police once we've done that. There are plenty of folks who say, and I have some sympathy for parts of this, that if we've got other people doing this work, what is it that the police are doing? And do we need the same size police departments that we have? Do they need to be organized in the same way? And also just point out, certainly the union says, I read some of the comments and looked at some of the interviews. This will give us time for actual police work or for engaging with the community. So, I think one of the questions we need to think ahead to is, what is the role of the police in a world in which, to be blunt, municipalities have built out the social services that maybe they should have had for a long time. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, one of the things that concerns me is that the breadth of social services, mental health, public health resources, that's probably the greatest area that we're lacking as a society. And so what do we have as an attribute? And one attribute we have is we have a very violent society. And this doesn't exist across the entire world. Many other countries, democratic countries, do not have the level of gun violence that we have here in the United States. And we also have, because of the systems and the breakdown of our systems, we have conflicts, but we also have narcotic and substance abuse issues that then compound issues of conflict, issues of violence in our communities, of social decay, lives that are lost, and then also industries that are fueled by those addictions. The concept of, for instance, in Los Angeles today, 7 people in LA County are dying every day due to fentanyl overdoses. And what is fueling that is, of course, the opioid addiction across the entire country that has existed for decades. And so I imagine a future that we can impact those larger social and public health issues. And as we see success there, the role of policing will be reduced, because the role of policing the areas of conflict will be reduced. But last year were 382 homicides and more than 1,000 shooting victims. The police are not solving, we solved 3 out of the 4 of those homicides. We need to be able to solve 4 of those 4. We solved about 20% of our shooting victims. Those are victims that are in lives that are jeopardized, that policing needs to do a better job at. And when we ask, well, why aren't we doing a better job? It's because our resources are drawn in so many other different directions. In concert with needing to build a trust relationship with our communities so that they can work with us to identify those rare, much smaller group of individuals who are involved in this violence and this predatory behavior. So I see, the premise, which is, can we improve the health of this country? And I believe we have to be committed to doing that. mental health in this country is woefully inadequate. It's been inadequate since the 60s, with the promise that in an effort to improve the rights of individuals who were previously institutionalized, that we're going to put them in community settings, and we're going to give them the necessary help and support so that they're functional, they're safe, and they lead productive lives. Hasn't been delivered since then. But yet in our medical professions, we have specialties beyond specialties. It's amazing. You look at the longevity of people and their public health today, far improvements because of research, investment in health, in medicine, but yet we allow on mental health professionals for a lack of those resources. And of course, every university today is struggling to meet that need. And I believe in part it's because we frankly are not providing the necessary compensation, job design, and so forth to have that field attractive to individuals that can build a scale, what we're talking about here, you and I are hoping to see. And our willingness to say, well, we'll never see it in 5 years is a cop-out.
Yeah, no, so look, I appreciate your candor. I appreciate, the need to recognize, as we all do, that we need more social services to make this a healthier and safer place. I heard you say and appreciate your noticing that, in that safe world, we may not need the same police that we have now, but you ticked off, I think I caught them, 3 roles for the police. And I just want to ask actually questions about each of them. So one is dealing with violent crime. One is trust building in communities. And one of them is clearing crimes. I want to start with the last one first, just because it raises an intriguing question, not about whether we need fewer police, but whether we need a different like octane mix, if you think about your gasoline, like a different composition of the police force. So clearing crimes is something people talk about all the time, the need to do it. People point to the statistics about, clearance rates falling in some cities, the desire to do better. I may be ignorant, but I view that as much as detective work as it is patrol work. And it makes me wonder whether, the police force of the future focused solely on police work isn't in fact comprised differently of, more forensic analysts, more detectives, fewer patrol officers. Any thoughts on that?
Well, that's what's happened. I talk frequently about the arc of policing, over the last, and of course, this is a build after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the moral arc of the universe. It's long, but it's bent towards justice. I think the moral arc, the arc of policing, is also long, and its arc is not just, and it's bent towards, service and building trust in our communities. When we look at, for instance, policing today, we have many more specialists in our civilian side for forensics, for crime scene analysis, DNA work today. The O.J. Simpson trial, 1994, right? Blood evidence, one of the first major trials that talked about that and identifying the person responsible for that terrible double homicide. It is light years ahead today from where it was. And we solve crimes because of that technology and the investment, not in gun toters or in police officers, but in scientists and lab technicians. And in recognizing that the sciences of the scene is not just the perpetrator, but the scene is also the victim and the location, and how can we use science in order to improve the outcomes. The issue about clearances is public trust. Public trust is the overarching goal, I believe, building it, of policing. And so everything else serves that. And if it doesn't, then why are you doing it? And so clearance rates, how it serves the public's trust is that people believe, they should be able to believe in a democracy, that government is there to serve them and support them and allow them to have the liberties and the freedoms that we promise as a land. And government provides that in many different activities. Policing is one of them, that people whose rights are violated, whether violently or otherwise, that the government will work to identify those persons responsible and act as a deterrent to them, to act also as a general deterrent to others, that there's some social contract that people have to abide by, and that there's consequences of these actions. Clearances give that assurance. And when you don't solve those crimes, homicides, shooting victims, robberies, burglaries, it sets 2 things. One, the public becomes disenfranchised. Their trust in police and government goes down, and they stop calling the police and they resort to their own means of safety. And then secondly, the criminal element recognizes that there is not deterrence and there's not consequences. and they amplify because of greed, because of their belief in their social contract that they have the right to do this, because society's dealt them a wrong hand, or whatever the circumstances are. And so that balance, just in clearances alone, is something that, as an organization, while we're down more than 1,000 police officers since 2019, we have prioritized investigators. We have prioritized ensuring that investigations, particularly involving violent crime, were increased, while at the same time, we haven't given up, and we've recognized that a police presence or uniform appearance in neighborhoods is an overarching concern, that people also see a presence of officers to know that there is a deterrent value there.
So, I got you then on I think we agree that the nature of police departments and the staffing of them may change over time, and already is changing, as you explained. I want to dig in on the community trust part of it, and I'm not sure how to ask this, and I also know that it's not going to be an easy conversation. But and I'm sure I captured your words wrong here about how it's kind of the main thing or the first thing, and I guess what I might say about it is it's foundational, that it's hard to do the rest without community trust.
Okay.
But it can't be any secret to you that trust is sundered in many communities. And I'm sure it is no secret to you that it's sundered in part because of how people perceive the police and what it is that the police have done in communities. And yet I noticed that the president of the union said repeatedly that he was very eager to have officers involved in community engagement. And so I would just love to hear a word about.
So let me say that I agree that so public trust, building it in the confidence of policing, that's what gives us our authorities. For Robert Peel, right? The matter of why police exist, public of the police for the public, we work together. But they have to know that as they appropriate the authority to police, that they can trust the police in that assignment. And then the activities of police that are engaged in either build in that account or take away from it. But I think we also fall short in the assessment of that public trust in the larger scheme. When we look at what are the three most trusted institutions in America, it's the U.S. Armed Forces, Amazon, and police, in that order. Now, I believe that was a Pew research. And when we look at the underlying reason of why that is, well, let's look at the media relationship. Less than 40% of America trusts the media. When we look at elected officials in government, it's well under half. And while the department and the policing has disparities based along racial lines and social economic lines, what we see in Los Angeles, particularly in the aftermath of George Floyd, is our work in the last 3 years have built to build and bolster that trust. Today, in LAPD, we see that LAPD, how's it doing? All categories, maintaining safety, 69% of the respondents, which were spread across demographically all areas of Los Angeles. How about maintaining safety? 69%. Treating the community with respect. 71% of Angelenos said the Los Angeles Police Department treats them with respect. And I recognize that we need to have that number at 100%. And that is our pursuit. But when we ask for the comparison data, and you look and think about what's the rate of confidence in the national government, state and locals, it falls far short than that. And so I believe that we're listening to their needs. We're seeing improvements in those areas. We have more work to do, and the strategies that we're seeing here before us today that we're talking about, we see as adding to that conversation. My concern is it won't add to it if those alternatives aren't there or they don't perform at a satisfactory level. And instead, the most visible form of government, LAPD, law enforcement, will suffer from the court of public opinion, because what ultimately will be responsible is the buck stops here. While the police officers, they refuse to come out, and they refer me to somebody who never shows up. And when they do show up, they don't solve my problem. So therefore, law enforcement gets wrapped up in the same criticism and negative perception that government is meeting their needs.
Yeah, maybe we should all go work for Amazon. That's one of the lessons I took away there. I mean, I think we come at this from slightly different perspectives, but I think we both recognize that there's a lot of work to be done in communities of color, and it's very tricky to figure out how to start from where we are now and move to a sound place there. I did notice in the union statement that there was concern about, one of the things that got mentioned that jumped out at me was officer morale. And I know that the force is down, that there are not nearly as many officers. My hope is, and I guess your hope is, that moving in this direction where we're getting the right tools into the right jobs is going to enhance the way that the community overall sees what government is providing, and therefore make the world a better, healthier, safer place. So I'll ask you if that's fair, but I realized we just blew through an hour. I don't know how we did that. I feel like we could go another hour. And I have some wrap up things that I am supposed to say. So you can agree or disagree with me, but also if there's anything you want to say in a minute or two, I want to make sure I give you the chance.
No, again, as we started this premise, our conversation for this last hour, and I've enjoyed this, is we agree that in building a better society is looking at the role of policing and finding ways in which to delaminate activities that have been historically assigned to them because of whether they think that they just think we're the right people, or and more commonly, there's no one else to do it, so we'll have the police do it.
Yeah, no, I think we're largely in agreement there, and I think that the minute that I saw the union announcement, I thought, boy, this is a watershed moment. I mean, this is a moment where a very large police union is coming to the recognition that many other people have, that we need to be looking for different tools, and we need to be maximizing those tools in society. And I'm hoping that we can take the unit, the moment, and build upon it, from every dimension. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of some of the difficulties, like getting dispatch to work to do this properly.
This is, there's 32 teams in the NFL. And every September, they're all starting for the Super Bowl. They all play the same basic game. They all have playbooks and they have history of decades. And it's talent-based, but execution is what gets them to that championship game. And I think the execution, we know what we need to do as a society to find alternatives, to deepen the well of those resources and to assign them. And we have safeguards and buffers that we need to have in place. It's the execution. Can we, as a society, are we willing to do this? Or are we just going to, again, have that aspirational intent, be willing to say, well, this won't happen in my lifetime. Perhaps it'll happen to someone else. Edison never would have gotten accomplished what he accomplished. And the greatness of America has never been to say, well, we can't get it done in this generation. But instead to say, no, we're going to take this very tangled, knotty problem, and we're going to see what are the things that have allowed it to be in this circumstance, and move forward.
Yeah, I don't, the reason that we got into this work heavily is because I really felt, I see they've put our website up, that there were two problems we were all facing. One was that we were going to be under ambitious in this work. Mental health is super important, but you and I have identified violence interrupters and mediators and a range of different skills that we need out on the street. And the other was that there were going to be really hard challenges that we need to try to solve, because otherwise people were going to give up. So I think we share that. I want to thank you so much, Chief, for having this conversation with me, and for thinking through all these issues. They have put up our www.safetyreimagined.org, the website where we're putting all of our material, including these webinars and a lot of resources for jurisdictions that are considering doing this work. I don't want to keep I noticed you could see how many participants they are, and people actually not only came, but they stayed. So that's unusual. So that's a credit, I guess, to you, Chief, and I want to thank you for joining us.